I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.
My name's Christopher Dickey. I work for Newsweek magazine and the Daily Beast. That's not the editor, that's the publication. And I am here partly because I wrote a book back in 2009 called Securing the City Inside America's Best Counterterror Force, the NYPD. So it's been a little bit like Old Home Week this morning. We have a great panel here. Judy has done a magnificent job, and the Manhattan Institute have done a terrific job pulling together these panels for this morning, and this, I think, is really a terrific one. To my left, we have Graham Allison, who teaches at Harvard University and who's the author of Nuclear Terrorism, one of the scariest books I ever read. We've got Brian Michael Jenkins, Senior Advisor to the President of RAND Corporation. And even though he's only a year or so older than me, I feel like I've been reading Brian's work for all my life. I mean, on terrorism. He's covered every aspect of terrorism over the years. Mitch Silber, the head of analysis for the NYPD Intelligence Division. The division itself is one of the great fascinating institutions in the city and the country. And the analysis done by the division has really broken some remarkable ground, particularly on the radicalization in the West, which was Mitch co-authored. And Stephen Flynn of the Center for National Policy, who is not only looking at the kinds of traumas brought on by terrorism, but also the kinds of traumas to the American system and American life that could be brought on by other kinds of disasters and other kinds of threats to Homeland Security. So I wanted, actually, because Stephen has to leave a little bit earlier than everybody else, I wanted to start with Stephen and see if we can try and put this whole issue of terrorism into perspective. There was an awful sense in the immediate wake of 9/11, and then certainly as we launched the wars in Afghanistan and then in Iraq, that we were looking at a really apocalyptic threat to the United States homeland from terrorists. That seems to have subsided, at least in the public imagination. But at the same time, as your book, Edge of Disaster, points out, we are facing enormous threats from natural disasters and other issues. What do you think is the next game changer for American society? Is it likely to be a natural disaster, or is it likely to be a terrorist event? And are we prepared to deal with either one?
Well, I think where I would start off is just by highlighting that we're clearly not dealing with the kind of existential threat we were faced during the Cold War. I mean, we literally had tens of thousands of nuclear weapons poised at each other with a hair trigger. That could eliminate life on Earth as we knew it. We're stepped back from that level of threat with regard to most of the terrorist scenarios. At the same time, there are a lot of very dangerous things that can happen, both man-made accidents as well as natural ones that can destroy lots of property and destroy lots of lives. And the capacity for society to deal with all that is really in play. And so as I look at 9/11 as a wake-up call, it should have been a wake-up call in part, an introspective, how well prepared are we for dealing with these kinds of incidents? And that's not actually what our reaction was, though. Our reaction was essentially to say, well, this is a threat that came from abroad, and we deal with it with the traditional tools of national security by taking it abroad. And so in the reframe of the time, we need to take the battle of the enemy, or we do it over there so we don't have to do it here. The only defense is offense. So the focus was essentially to take the national security apparatus we had, put it on steroids, and try to keep the threat at bay. Now that has had some results, and some good in terms of clearly eliminating some of the real folks we were worried about and involved with the scenario of 9/11. But it also has morphed the threat in different ways as well. The adversary's adjusted. So if I step back from it, really sort of three key things jump for me as I look 10 years later. First, I think the core wake-up call of 9/11 should be, and this is a source of some anxiety I think we should still continue to have, appropriate anxiety, is what we saw was warfare will be fought against the United States probably in the 21st century. And the arithmetic is pretty straightforward. The United States has more conventional military capability than the entire world combined, plus some. So as a student of warfare, that suggests to me that war becomes obsolete or it changes. So in a sort of strange way, the overwhelming military power of the United States has made the world safer asymmetric warfare, which looks a lot like terrorism. The targeting of civil, economic underpinnings of a society, because that's where presumably you can get a bang for your buck. And so as I would forecast any adversary of the United States, they're going to do al-Qaeda-like things as a way to confront, primarily targeting critical infrastructure and so forth. So the threat remains real as a long term. The al-Qaeda as a force to carry out what I just said, that has significantly been diminished, largely morphed down to much smaller players, and we've got more expertise than I can bring to bear here at the table on that. But the second thing is, if this new battle space is fundamentally in the civil economic space, we need to clearly engage the people who are in that space as a part of the effort. And this is something historically Americans have been very good at. From the citizen soldier tradition, we draw from our greatest asset, which is civil society, and bring them into the mix. But again, almost as a legacy of the Cold War, we've relied almost exclusively on a national security apparatus to take this battle to the enemy and allow us to sort of go about our lives unfettered, largely by this. And let me just drive home a single number that really sort of helps to do this. Conservatively, we spent about $1 trillion in the war in Iraq. If you do that arithmetic, that turns out to about $273 million a day, every single day, 365 days a year for 10 years. That's how the math works out. The total amount we have invested in securing the Port of New York, New Jersey, in terms of grants and other resources since 9/11 has been somewhere in the order of $150 million in 10 years. So that's roughly 9 hours in Iraq. Now, if warfare has changed and we're investing in a new war that recognizes the civil economic space is where threats may happen, that doesn't suggest, in terms of dollars telling where your priorities are, that you really have a shift in priority. And so that, I think, is a key, how to engage civil society. And the final piece, I would say, is how we respond, and more importantly, how we react or overreact to terrorism fuels the threat. That's another lesson of 9/11. And therefore, this concept of resilient, having our society being more capable of being able to withstand, rapidly respond, and recover to threats is clearly key. We've got everything in the prevention basket, and I hope that works. But when you hear statements like we often said after 9/11, that we have to be right 100% of the time, the terrorists have to be right only once, I'm like, good luck with that. When have we ever been right 100% of the time? This is a complicated, messy problem. There's a reasonable probability that terrorist acts will happen. They're animated by they're getting a big bang for their buck. We control in our civil society the buck we deliver by the safeguards we put in place and how we respond and recover.
Yeah. You know, because you have such a wide range of interests, Brian, I'm going to ask you about a nightmare scenario that I think touches on this question of resilience. I was talking to some very senior people from Homeland Security a few weeks ago, and I asked them, what do you wake up thinking about at 3 o'clock in the morning? And they said a biological weapons attack. That was what scares the hell out of them. And I know from working with the NYPD that that is something that is almost impossible to prevent in terms of detection. There's no Geiger counters that are going to pick up anthrax if somebody starts to distribute it. Is that your nightmare scenario for an apocalyptic terror attack, or do you have other ones, Brian?
I mean, there's a variety of nightmare scenarios. To get up to the scale, that is to exceed the scale of a 9/11, does require really moving into either the realm of nuclear or biological. Conventional explosives, even chemical attacks are not going to ascend to that level. And you're right about the problem of detection. We do have detection capabilities, but that is after the dispersal probably has already taken place. We may find out about it first in terms of front lines in hospitals and in doctors' prescriptions and so on. And so that is a concern. You know, it's difficult to assign probabilistic statements to these things because it depends on your time frame. It also depends on the scale of the event itself. We have had biological events. I mean, the anthrax letters was one. So we have a relatively low threshold for entering that. We're already there. So the real question is the likelihood of seeing something on a scale of, let's just use this as a marker, 9/11 or above, where we're talking about thousands of
3,000, 4,000 people killed.
That probably would put us into the realm of some type of contagious disease. It could be done with other substances, anthrax, for example, some other things. Although there are going to be some serious operational problems in terms of quantities, quality, dispersal mechanisms, and so on. Real threat, again, over a long period of time, we have to take it into account. Is it something that, you know, we're likely to see Al-Qaeda do in the next couple of months? Probably not. The one problem, and this is an important thing to remember, when we come into some of the contagious diseases, and this is an important point, in today's world, if somebody were to unleash something like smallpox or some of the other more exotic substances, this would not be an event that would be confined to the United States. I mean, in today's world, it takes only perhaps 24 to 72 hours to start moving something right around the world. And while we certainly would suffer from that, despite the current weaknesses in our public health system, we would come through it. When this thing moved around the world and began to hit cities, whether it's Karachi or Cairo, there we're really going to begin to see massive casualties. And I think that may contain within it some deterrent for those who are thinking about this, that this is not something which is easily contained and focused if we get into a contagious disease scenario, but rather something which will have devastating effects on the planet if it gets loose.
That's a happy thought. Graham, you know, as I say, your book on nuclear terrorism scared the hell out of me, but I then was looking back at a book called The Curve of Binding Energy, written by John McPhee about almost 40 years ago now. It came out in '74. And in '74, he wrote that, or one of the experts he talked to who had worked on nuclear weapons said, "I think we have to live with the expectation that once every 4 or 5 years a nuclear explosion will take place and kill a lot of people." It hasn't happened. Why hasn't it happened?
Well, it's a good question, and let me step back and then I'll come to I mean, I would say the fact that it hasn't happened, if you go back to '74, where what McPhee was worried about even more than a single nuclear weapon going off was a nuclear war, is not unrelated to what the U.S. did over that period. So,
but he was worried about proliferation. I mean, the message of that part of the book was that it's easier to make a nuclear device than you would think, and a lot of countries are going to have them, and eventually even groups will have them, and so every 3 or 4 or 5 years we'll have not H bombs, we'll have mushroom clouds.
And I would say that was not a radical view in the mid-'70s of the risks that were posed. And I come at this with the national security analyst framework. From a traditional national security framework, one thinks about threat as likelihood times consequences. So if the consequences, for example, of a nuclear Armageddon were essentially catastrophic beyond belief.
End of life on the planet. Yeah.
Maybe we erase the U.S. as we know it. A very small likelihood creates a categorical imperative to do everything conceivable to reduce that, to prevent it from happening. And in the Cold War, I'm a proud old veteran Cold Warrior, we spent $4 trillion over 4 decades, and excuse me, we won, okay? So this was a big event. And nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union, which in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, if you go back to 1962, was, Kennedy thought was a chance of 1 in 3 and even, that this would end up in such a catastrophe. Didn't happen. Now, some of it was good things we did, some of it was good fortune. In the case of the nuclear terrorism and loose nukes, there's a wonderful clip that I use for an epigraph in my nuclear terrorism book from the Secretary of Defense in December 1991. So he's on Meet the Press, you can go look it up, and the interviewer asks him, Secretary of Defense, if the Soviet Union disappears and all those nuclear weapons they have, say 25,000 of them, then are in effect up for grabs. Well, what's going to happen? Who was the Secretary of Defense in December 1991? He's famous in the paper these days, Dick Cheney, okay? Just a for example. So he says, well, look, if they do a great job, I mean, really, if they do as well as FedEx, they'll have maybe control of 99% of them. So that means 250 of them would be loose somewhere. Now, how in the world can we just about to reach the 20th anniversary of the disappearance of the Soviet Union and not one of those nuclear weapons, has been found outside? I would say we should give thanks to God first thing in the morning and last thing at night, because that's a huge part of it. But I would say this is not unrelated to very important things that the U.S. government did with the non-Luger Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. We've invested about $10 billion in helping motivate and secure and eliminate those nuclear weapons. And I'd say I would also give huge credit to the Russian professionals in the 12th GUMO, the folks who were part of the Ministry of Defense, who regarded this as their jewel box and who took good care of it. So a bunch of things came together, but I think if we go back to your bottom line, so if I ask myself, consequences. So one nuclear bomb explodes in one city. As Obama says, that'll change our world. Okay? So a very low probability of that times that consequence leads me to think that President Bush and President Obama are correct in saying that's the single largest threat, and that we should do all the things that we can reasonably do to reduce those risks. And actually, we've done a huge number of things. So I think Commissioner Kelly's list is absolutely right. Let me mention one other thing, because I think there's this, I can see a kind of a new conventional wisdom rising that says, we're no longer vulnerable to a 9/11 scale terrorist attack. And again, I would say all of us are confused because we're 10 years into a set of events that are hard to locate in the course of history. But I don't believe it. I don't subscribe to the new theory about apocalyptic terrorism. Because I ask myself, and I think Brian was starting us down that track, what happened a month after 9/11? The anthrax attack. Who did that? Well, if I believe the FBI report, which I do, there was a guy named Ivins. Okay, who's he? Microbiologist working in a counter-bioterrorism lab. He goes and makes a bunch of anthrax. If he had taken the anthrax that he made and put in those envelopes and distributed it appropriately, so in a manner that he could have figured out, okay, he could have killed 10,000 people. So that's one person. Thought, yeah. So that's one person. So how long will it be before, I notice at MIT now, freshmen in their January J term manipulate genes if they're biochemistry majors. So this relentless advance of technology and diffusion of knowledge, I think is the sort of the other side of this equation that leaves me thinking with a lot of agenda to work on.
Mitch, nobody has studied the real terrorists that we've encountered over the last 10 years any more closely, psychologically, educationally, in terms of their capabilities, their organization? Nobody has studied them any more closely than you. Do you see a lot of, in the terrorist universe that you study, do you see a lot of people with the resources and the ability to alter genes, build nuclear weapons, otherwise create these kinds of threats? I mean, my impression of most terrorists is that they're dumb as posts. They're not very bright. And when occasionally you have really imaginative ones, and then they don't use nuclear weapons, they use box cutters to take down the Twin Towers. What's your sense of the sort of the depth of the bench of the terrorists and the depth of the intellect of the terrorists that you've looked at?
Well, I think there's a wide spectrum in terms of what we've seen over the years, terrorists who have appeared on the radar. Certainly there are those who would fit that category as not particularly academically challenged individuals who, were lucky if they could get them into the right place at the right time. And then you also have to understand that the way this threat is metastasized is that there's a much broader range of individuals who are attracted to the ideology, who might be motivated by the ideology. And while early years of Al-Qaeda, many of these individuals had physician and hard science backgrounds, it's certainly something that's not out of the realm of possibility for individuals with hard science backgrounds to adopt this ideology, want to carry out some type of attack in the name of this ideology, and in doing it, you need the skills that they've developed. In Glasgow, in the UK, the bombing in London, certainly you had physicians. Now, they happened to be physicians who couldn't set up a car bomb that could operate correctly.
They were really bad bombers.
Bad bombers, but they may have been better physicians and better in the natural sciences. So I think we have to be careful in assuming that we're going to have a terrorist who's a bumbling fool, because you know what? The guys in Madrid who killed 191 people, they weren't scientists, they weren't doctors, they were drug dealers, but it still left 191 Spanish people dead.
I think we'll open up the floor to questions now, if there are any. Let's see. Anybody have any questions? Here we are talking about apocalypse. Nobody's got any questions? Here we go. Hold on a second for the microphone.
There was a television program last night on Channel 13 PBS, Frontline, talking about the Bush administration's creation of a national security bureaucracy in response to 9/11. And one of the major points of the program was that Bush administration built an external prison system for rendering suspected terrorists outside the United States of America, and that the strategy of the administration was essentially to attack Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations outside the United States. One of the panelists has suggested that we would be better off shifting resources from this external attack on terrorists to hardening targets within the country. And I just want to ask the panel generically what they think about shifting a strategy from going after the terrorists externally outside the United States to hardening targets internally.
Well, Steve, that's your thing.
If I might really say, is balance is really what I'm talking about versus in a fundamental, either or situation. What essentially the core argument I'm making is, if you think about it as essence, national security for every country in the world is first to protect its nation, and then if there's any power left over, to protect its interests beyond its shores. The definition of national security in the United States is only that second thing, to project power and be able to influence things beyond its shores. And what happens largely inside the United States is domestic security. We didn't even have a term for it. We coined homeland, rather clumsy one, to kind of get at it. And that basically falls to states and locals. The sum of our homeland is the state and locals and territories. And then you look at that capability. Now, there's enormous capability in the NYPD, as we've heard today. And that being plussed up was largely by the investment that this community has made, this metropolitan area has made. Not a fundamental shift in the way that Washington views investment in resources. It essentially is assumed that the large, heavy lift, particularly when it comes to critical infrastructure, which is largely privately owned, Well, there should be enough incentive there for captains of industry to take care of that. Mayors and governors will do what needs to be in the home front, and the investment that we have with national security should be largely expended beyond our shores. And so what I'm sort of arguing is what's motivating, and I would suggest even the morphing of the threat that's gone to a sort of more of a less is more style, is a recognition by terrorists that you don't need to have actually a catastrophic scale attack to get a very desired result, which is how America reacts or overreacts to those events in very costly and sometimes dysfunctional ways. Small ones, near misses will work.
Yeah, actually,
and so it motivates this, and so it should follow what resilience should.
Yeah, it's amazing now that you have terrorists, particularly Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Yemen, claiming credit for failed attacks, because they know that psychologically the failed attacks are almost as good as a successful attack.
And the one thing that we can control is how we respond. That we're a democratic society. That's within our power. We can't provide every. And just two quick illustrations of. I mean, the only successful counterterrorism effort mustered on 9/11 was aboard United 93. That's it. That's the only success we have of that day. That should have been something we were recognized as civil society being important. Secondly, on this particular location, a story virtually nobody knows in New York, never mind the rest of the country, the largest sea lift in history happened in Lower Manhattan on 9/11. As a result of a armada of ferry boats, party boats, commuter boats, tugboats, who evacuated 500,000 people from Lower Manhattan in 9 hours. To put that in comparison, Dunkirk in World War II, it was 339,000 British and French troops evacuated in 9 days. Something larger than Dunkirk happened on 9/11 as a result of civil society's capacity to respond, and we didn't even acknowledge the event happened. That's, so I'm getting at is not, again, the either or. It really is a balance. 9/11, the attack was not an importation of a weapon of mass destruction. It was conversion of a domestic airliner into one. They were here. I mean, they originated from far, but they were here. And how we reacted to 9/11 is a big part of what has fueled the sense of threat. So all that should be on the table 10 years later of things that we continue to sort of discuss about how we go forward versus how do we tweak the national security apparatus to deal with the threat as it's morphed. Very important conversation, that last one. I'm not disparaging it. It's just, hello, we still haven't had the first conversation on the other side of the coin.
Let me go back to the question, because I think if you say you've got your 9/11 an attack, how are you going to respond? And there's offense and defense, just the way you put the question. Well, where's your relative balance? And Steve's arguing for a balance. But I would say that fortunately, so far, the number of organizations that are capable enough and determined enough to conduct attacks like 9/11 are very few. And the elimination of such an organization is good in itself, because dead men can't conduct additional attacks. And it's also a good lesson for other groups. Attack us, and that's a death sentence for you. Now, fortunately, there's not a whole lot of groups that are eager to commit suicide. There's some, but not many. There are not many organized groups that are in that business. There are not many organized that are in that business that are also organizationally capable. I mean, the 9/11 attack was a, quote, elegant attack in professional terms. That took a high degree of coordination and consultation. So fortunately, that's a small group. I would say the offense part of the response was a significant success. Yeah.
You know, the slogan used again and again over the last 10 years was, we're fighting the terrorists over there so we don't have to fight them here. Steve alluded to that. Did fighting the terrorists over there actually keep us from having to fight the terrorists here? Because now we're looking at radicalization issues. Looks like we fought them over there and we're going to have to fight them here. Brian, what's your bottom line on particularly the Iraq War in terms of terrorism?
Well, I mean, you have to put aside the Iraq War, because the Iraq War was not part of an overreaction to 9/11, but rather a policy decision to eliminate what was perceived on the basis of the intelligence they had, a potential future threat to the United States. It was portrayed as part of the broader war on terror, but in fact was a diversion and a distraction. But if you look at the measures that were taken after 9/11 in Afghanistan and worldwide, there is no question that in a desperate effort to reduce Al-Qaeda's operational capabilities, and keep in mind, at that time, we had no idea how many more 9/11s were in the pipeline. And so an immediate offense was necessary. When you're shot at, you shoot back. And as a consequence of those efforts, we have degraded Al-Qaeda's operational capabilities. Their training camps were dispersed. That was important, not so much because these were the size of Fort Benning, Georgia, but simply these were easily accessible destinations for volunteers from around the world that provided Al-Qaeda's planners with a continuing talent show of individuals they could assemble into these plots. We decimated the leadership. We kept the remaining leaders on the run. We squeezed the finances, and as a consequence, really, of unprecedented cooperation among the intelligence services and law enforcement organizations of the world, we have made their operating environment a lot more hostile. And so we have degraded their operational capabilities. At the same time, Al-Qaeda is a resilient and opportunistic enterprise, and it constantly adapts to new conditions. So what we confront now is something that is far more decentralized, far more dependent upon its regional affiliates, on its allies, and on its ability to inspire and instruct individual volunteers to carry out attacks wherever they are. And in fact, Al-Qaeda has embraced a do-it-yourself strategy, urging its followers to do whatever they can wherever they are. That means the good news on that is that it has, as I say, reduced their ability to carry out some of the large-scale attacks that they were capable of before. The difficulty of that is that the more diffuse threat, the very tiny conspiracies, decisions made by individuals who see this Al-Qaeda ideology as a conveyor for their individual discontents, that is something that is far more difficult to deal with. And so probably in different forms, we'll be dealing with this for years to come.
For years to come. Well, Mitch?
Let me jump in there. You know, the statement is, because you fight them over there, you won't have to fight them here. I mean, actually what we've seen in the years since the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is, in some cases, because you fight them over there, you will have to fight them here. And what I mean by that is, if you look at many of the major plots in the West since 9/11, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in Canada, in the UK, and in the US, when you read and you go through the trial transcripts and you say, what are these people saying? What's motivating them to do this? In Australia, in Canada, in the US, it's a coercion strategy. We want to hit Australia hard, so they'll get out of Iraq. We want to hit the Spanish hard, they'll get out of Iraq. We want to hit the Canadians hard, get out of Afghanistan. This comes up time and time again as the rationale for what their activity. Now, this isn't to argue against going to war in Afghanistan and Iraq. Those policy decisions were made and I believe were valid. But there are consequences that we have to deal with, and that is a Najib al-Azazi looking at drone strikes in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, a Faisal Shahzad observing this, observing the collateral damage that invariably is going to happen. As precise as we want to be, there's going to be some collateral damage, and this may serve as a motivating factor for revenge, but also, again, to coerce a Western power to get out of these fields of jihad in their mind.
If I could, maybe just because I'll have to wrap, just to maybe a final word. It's precisely because our intelligence wasn't very good, and that there could have been lots of things in store, that it seemed to me we would have looked around and say, what is truly critical and truly vulnerable here at home, and see, can we mitigate that risk? And my critique has been that largely did not happen. we really focused on hoping that by fighting back that we wouldn't have to address those issues. And the fact is, because the threat has morphed, because it has potentially more of a homeland dimension, the good news with Al-Qaeda clearly is not a super level right now, but the genie is out of the bottle. The recognition that the United States is built on critical infrastructure in a civil society that essentially is very open and right now quite brittle and vulnerable would suggest that that deserves some attention as we look for the next decade going forward.
Thank you very much, Steve. This gentleman here has a question. Microphone's coming up behind you.
Thank you. My name is Michael Myers. In an era of biological warfare and possible nuclear warfare, it's 10 years after 9/11. We still have not secured our borders. We still haven't fixed the telecommunications to the first responders. They still can't communicate with each other. We still have people objecting to body scans at airports. And every time we get a high activity alert, the NYPD puts extra police in the subways with high-powered rifles and guns. And we still have New Year's Eve celebrations, and NYPD says they're scanning for radiation or whatever. Now, what I've heard from you is none of these things really are real, that there seems to be an illusion of security. And so, is it real or is it not real? And the 9/11 Commission co-chairs can continue to say, we haven't done anything in terms of their concrete, specific recommendations to prevent, much less, and in a world you can't see, biological warfare, we still have this logo, see something, say something. I don't get it.
Well, there's still a lot of bad guys out there who want to do bad things. I mean, if Faisal Shahzad had been a little bit better bomb builder, they would have blown up a lot of people in Times Square. If Najibullah Zazi had not been picked up communicating overseas, had not been tracked from Denver to New York, they could have easily blown up themselves and a lot of other people on the subways.
But the guy gets on a plane and counts the tickets back and forth.
But I take your point. What do you think, Brian?
Well, first of all, you indicated that some of the security measures may be illusion, and that's a valid point. And fact is, it is a function of security measures to create, in part, that illusion. I mean, we did manage to make it through a Cold War by basically a strategy of deterrence. And if we look at it's hard to measure. It's hard to measure the effectiveness of any security measure. This is not something where you can easily apply cost-benefit analysis. But if you look at the array of security measures at airports, as irritating as they may be to travelers, the fact is that over a 4-decade period that we have been imposing these measures, the number of terrorist attempted hijackings has steadily declined worldwide. In fact, since 9/11, there have been no terrorist hijackings. The number of attempts by terrorists to sabotage aircraft has declined. I mean, decade by decade, that has come down. They still remain obsessed with attacking airplanes, but are now obliged to do so with smaller devices, more exotic explosives, different kinds of detonating systems. As a result, they're having a quality control problem. That is, these devices aren't working. And so since 9/11, just to stay in the realm of aviation for a moment, just using that as an example, there have been 75 terrorist attacks on commercial aviation worldwide, which have killed 157 people, 88 of those brought down in 2 airplanes out of Moscow by suicide bombers. But compared to previous decades, that is a remarkable reduction when you keep in mind that in the 1970s we were dealing with an attempted terrorist hijacking or an attempted terrorist sabotage of an aircraft on average about one a month. So clearly progress has been made. Now, that's the deterrent side. On the actual side, these plots that have been uncovered are events. I would not assert that every single one of those plots, had it not been uncovered, would have resulted in an attack. Some of those were in the realm of premature discussion. But some of them would have, and that would have had an enormous impact on the country. I agree with Steve Flynn, probably too much of an impact because Americans unrealistically have come to expect 100% security. That's not real.
You know, we're going to talk about civil liberties in another panel a little later this afternoon, and I think we'll come back to some of this, but one of the issues that I don't think people pay enough attention to in counterterrorism is the psychological warfare aspect of what the authorities do. And a lot of it is theater. A lot of it is psychological warfare. We understand that terrorism is done for a psychological effect. A lot of what the police and intelligence services do is done for a psychological effect.
But let me just make one footnote. I think the paradox you get at is this feeling that, gee, we're running faster and faster. How can we be falling further behind? Okay? And it's because in the war on terrorism, we're not running against the clock. There's some other guys out there running too. So we may be running faster, which we are, but if we're ending up having lots of other competitors who are running faster, and if technology is continuing to empower them, we can have this feeling that it's unfair, but I would say it's part of the nature of the problem.
Got time, I'm afraid, for only one more question, and this gentleman has been waiting patiently. Can we get him a microphone?
Ed Thompson. I'd like to address the elephant in the country, if you will, and in this room, radical Islam. Both the Bush and the Obama administrations have gone to great pains to avoid the term and to avoid explicit exposés on the subject and so forth. And I haven't heard the term this morning, radical Islam. We hear about terrorists and their plots and your courageous efforts to counter them, which is valid. The discussion is valid. But to what extent do you understand, to what extent is the enemy, radical Islam, if you will, philosophy, clearly understood? To what depth do you understand the animal? Thank you.
Well, I think that's definitely Mitch's department.
There are a variety of different ways and terminologies one can use to talk about this. I think the important thing to start off with is that there is an ideological element to this. There was an ideological element to Nazi Germany, an ideological element to the Soviet Union. There's an ideological element here. Now the question is, well, what precisely are we talking about? Is this Islamic terrorism? Is this Islamist terrorism? Is this a political terrorism cloaked in a religious ideology? And it really requires going into the weeds and looking at the origins of this ideology and how it's evolved over time. But I think probably one of the best way to look at it is in terms that these individuals have political goals. Whether it was bin Laden getting the U.S. out of the Persian Gulf, getting the U.S. out of Saudi Arabia, causing the U.S. to stop supporting Israel. But the language that's used to articulate the justification for the acts is a language that comes from Islam, is a language that has some legitimacy in the Quran, and has an interpretation that can be backed up by Scripture. Now, is that the interpretation that the broader religious community has? No. This is a fringe interpretation. It's a minority interpretation. But there are elements that can be cited from Scripture that provide the justification for violence. Often it's taken out of context. It's not explaining where the violence came from historically. But nevertheless, there is that element to it. So in terms of the way we look at the actors who are committing these acts, In the end, they have political goals, but they're framing it in a religious terminology, and often they themselves are not particularly knowledgeable about the religion themselves. Often they're coming to it late in life and really only have this cut and paste understanding of the religion.
I think, if I may put my own 2 cents in here, I think one of the things that people tend to do is look at all terrorists as if they must be Islamists, all Islamists as if they must be terrorists. Actually, terrorists have certain elements in common. All of them have certain elements in common, whether they're Tamils or Irish or Islamic or Arab, whatever. What are those? They're basically testosterone. It's almost always guys, usually young guys. It's a narrative of repression. It doesn't mean that they are repressed. It means that they identify with people they see as being depressed, whether they're Catholics in Northern Ireland or Tamils in Sri Lanka or what have you. And these young men see themselves as offering a kind of deliverance to these people who are oppressed. They see themselves as knights in shining armor. That's why, for instance, Ayman Zawahiri's core ideological work is called Knights Under the Prophet's Banner. There is this whole chivalric thing that goes on. And it's not religious, particularly. It has to do with this narrative of repression and occupation. And finally, theater. They love to make a show. You especially since 9/11, I mean, you know these guys, anybody here know Roland Emmerich's movies, like Godzilla or, the Independence Day? Al-Qaeda guys love those movies. They used to watch them all the time. In fact, when one of them was picked up, Abu Zubaydah, he kept talking about the bridge in the Godzilla movie. And the FBI guys had never seen the Godzilla movie. So they didn't know he was talking about the Brooklyn Bridge and wanting to bring that down. So they love theater. So this works out into a very neat formulation. So you've got testosterone, narrative, theater, TNT, very explosive mixture. So, and not an Islamic, specifically Islamic problem. I think we got time actually for one more.
Can I make one footnote? There's a terrific book on this topic that puts the thing in a much bigger context by Louise Richardson called What Terrorists Want. And she looks at the last, 2,000 years of terrorism. So going back over a very broad range. So Richardson, Louise, What Terrorists Want. And I think as for perspective, it's very helpful and very consistent with what you said.
Yeah. Here, one last question, this gentleman here.
Bob Weisberg, I'm an academic in remission. And my question is speculative. During the Cold War, we had a lot of writing on deterrence. It was a big subject, everything from Herman Kahn, Thomas Schilling, we know the literature. There's been very little discussion on deterring rogue states like Iran or North Korea. Now, what would happen and we haven't mentioned cyber attacks, by the way, which are an important part of this. Let's suppose that North Korea, always short of cash, decides to sell somebody some weaponized anthrax or a computer program, and it's like a mafia hit. They then sell it to somebody else, who sells it to somebody else, and we suspect that the origins of the problem are, say, North Korea or Iran. Now, what kind of thinking on deterrence has gone on recently when you have a murky situation of the actual perpetrator? It's like the mafia hit. The actual perpetrator is 2-3 people removed from the person who ordered the hit. So how do we address a situation where suddenly we have this massive cyber attack, we think it comes from North Korea, but there are no fingerprints on the keyboard, or anthrax comes into the United States, it has all the earmarks of an Iranian laboratory, but we can't be sure.
Brian?
Let me not go with cyber or anthrax, but let me make it even more dramatic. Let's go with the nuclear scenario. Suppose, heaven forbid, a nuclear bomb goes off in an American city somewhere, and we don't necessarily know who done it, but the pressures to do something will be enormous. Moreover, it will be a world-changing event, and the rules that applied in the pre-nuclear terrorism world will not apply in the post-nuclear terrorism world. And I would submit that in those circumstances, where decisions are not going to be made over a period of a month, as they were between the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand and the beginning of World War I, instead of 30 days, those decisions are likely to be made in a period of 30 hours or less. And in those circumstances, the requirement for absolute convincing proof might not be that high, that there will be an argument that in a post-nuclear terrorism world, there will be an opportunity to deal with those who may represent potential threats. And a government of Iran, just to name one, may have about 30 minutes to try to persuade us that they didn't do it, and we may not give a damn. That is, for countries that think they can get away with an indirect strategic attack that causes major consequences for the United States, as a nuclear attack would, cannot expect the kinds of constraints that would exist before. And so their nuclear capabilities, in fact, become not a strategic asset, but a strategic liability.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up here, but just one cautionary thought. The most dangerous cyber weapon we've seen in action is the Stuxnet virus used against Iran, probably created by the United States and Israel, and now being dismantled by every computer hacker in the world to figure out how they can use it for their own ends. So the enemy may be us at the end of the day. All right, thank you very much.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.